The air in Aurelia tasted of old money and white truffles, a scent as carefully curated as the art on the walls. It was a world hermetically sealed from the struggles of the city outside, a gilded cage where conversations were held in hushed, reverent tones, punctuated only by the delicate chime of silver cutlery against fine porcelain. Crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceiling like frozen constellations, casting a warm, flattering glow on the faces of the city's power brokers. Through this opulent theater moved Ilara Vance, a ghost in a crisp black uniform. Her movements were a study in efficiency, a silent ballet of service that rendered her nearly invisible. She refilled water glasses with a wrist that never wavered, cleared plates with a silence that never disturbed, and offered the wine list with a gaze that was professional, polite, and utterly vacant. She was a perfect cog in a flawless machine, her presence as essential and as unnoticed as the oxygen in the room. Each step on the plush carpet, each perfectly folded napkin, was a testament to her discipline, a mask of serene competence that concealed the raging inferno of a life she had been forced to leave behind. The weight of the silver trays was nothing compared to the weight of her reality, a reality that existed a world away from the scent of seared scallops and vintage Bordeaux. To the untrained eye, she was just another waitress, another face in the endless cycle of service staff that catered to the whims of the elite. But beneath the starched uniform and the practiced neutrality, Ilara was a fortress. Her mind, a place no patron of Aurelia could ever imagine, was a library of legal precedent and corporate statute, its shelves lined with the ghosts of torts, contracts, and constitutional law. There were moments, between clearing a table and taking an order, when the memory of a Yale Law lecture hall would flicker in her mind's eye. The scent of old books, the resonant voice of a beloved professor, the thrill of deconstructing a complex case. That life, the life of a legal prodigy with a photographic memory, had been shattered 5 years ago. It had ended the day a predatory conglomerate called Viridian Global had swallowed her father's small manufacturing business whole, using a barrage of legally dubious maneuvers that left him financially and spiritually broken. The shock had triggered a massive stroke, silencing the vibrant man she adored and leaving him dependent on round-the-clock care. Ilara had walked away from her full scholarship and a future at a top-tier law firm without a second thought, trading casebooks for order pads to pay for the mounting medical bills that kept her father alive. Every smile she offered, every polite nod, was an act of devotion to him. The atmosphere in Aurelia, usually a low, contented hum, shifted palpably with his arrival. Marcus Thorne did not simply enter a room, he conquered it. He was the CEO of Viridian Hospitality, the parent company of Aurelia, and he moved with an aura of absolute ownership. The maitre d', a man who regularly greeted senators and celebrities with unflappable poise, seemed to shrink in his presence, his posture becoming almost apologetic. Thorne waved a dismissive hand, his eyes sweeping across the dining room not with appreciation for its beauty, but with the cold assessment of an owner checking his assets. He was dressed in a suit that likely cost more than Ilara's annual salary, its sharp lines and dark fabric absorbing the light around him. His face was a mask of bored arrogance, his lips set in a permanent, faint sneer. He didn't speak to the staff, he issued decrees, his voice cutting through the soft ambiance like a shard of glass. For Ilara, the sight of him sent a familiar, cold dread creeping into her stomach. She had seen men like him before, in the sterile boardrooms her father had been forced into. They were the architects of ruin, men who saw people not as human beings but as numbers on a balance sheet, obstacles to be removed or assets to be liquidated. The stage is set for a confrontation that will change everything. We're about to travel to the heart of this gilded cage in New York City, but first, we'd love to know where this story is reaching you today. Comment your location below, and be sure to subscribe to join our community. The collision of these two worlds is imminent, and the fallout will be a story of justice you will not want to miss. For in the heart of this temple of wealth, an act of simple human kindness is about to be treated as an unforgivable crime, and a forgotten legal genius is about to be reawakened by the very man who sought to destroy her world. The quiet waitress is about to remember exactly who she is, and the titan of industry is about to make the fatal mistake of underestimating the person serving his water. The silent war for a family's honor is about to begin, and it will all start with a single, compassionate gesture on a cold winter's night. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows that insulated Aurelia's patrons from the real world, Ilara saw him. The city was in the grip of a brutal cold snap, the kind of biting, relentless chill that seeped into your bones. On the street corner, huddled against the ornate stone facade of the building, was a man. He was thin, dressed in a jacket that was little more than a few layers of frayed fabric, and he shivered uncontrollably, his arms wrapped around himself in a futile attempt to generate warmth. While the diners inside spoke of stock options and summer homes in the Hamptons, this man was fighting a silent, desperate battle against the elements. Ilara watched as people passed him by, their gazes averted, their pace quickening as if his poverty were a contagious disease. A knot tightened in her chest. She saw not a stranger, but a reflection of her own family's vulnerability. She saw the terrifying fragility of a life, how quickly one could fall from security into desperation. The restaurant's policy was brutally clear. Do not interact with the outside. Maintain the illusion. Protect the bubble. But the image of the shivering man was superimposed in her mind with the image of her father in his hospital bed. Equally helpless, equally at the mercy of a cold, indifferent world. She made her decision in a heartbeat. It was an act of quiet rebellion, a choice to be human in a place that demanded she be a machine. Excusing herself from her station, she walked to the staff closet in the back. Her own coat was hanging there, a simple, worn wool coat she'd bought from a second-hand store. It wasn't much, but it was warm, and it was hers. Without a moment of hesitation, she slipped it off the hanger. Walking purposefully to the restaurant's heavy main door, she ignored the questioning look from the maitre d'. The blast of frigid air that hit her was a shock, a stark contrast to the climate-controlled perfection inside. She approached the man, who looked up at her with weary, surprised eyes. She didn't say a word. She simply unfolded her coat and draped it over his shaking shoulders, pulling the collar up around his neck. For a brief second, his hand touched hers as he steadied the garment, and his skin was as cold as ice. He gave her a look of profound, silent gratitude, a flicker of warmth in his tired eyes that meant more to her than any tip she had ever received. She gave him a small, sad smile, turned, and walked back inside, the cold already seeping through her thin uniform. Marcus Thorne had seen the entire exchange. He had been in the middle of a story meant to impress a potential investor, a tale of a ruthless corporate takeover, when his eyes had been drawn to the movement at the door. He watched Ilara's act of compassion not with warmth, but with a surge of pure, unadulterated rage. It was an imperfection, a stain on the pristine canvas of his establishment. His waitress, was interacting with street trash, bringing the ugliness of the outside world into his sanctuary of power. He saw it as a personal insult, a disruption of the carefully crafted image he sold for $500 a plate. The investor's gaze had followed his, a flicker of curiosity in his eyes. For Thorne, this was an opportunity to demonstrate control, to reinforce the unwritten rules of his universe. He snapped his fingers, a sharp, ugly sound that cut through the restaurant's decorum. The sound was a summons, and it was directed at Ilara. Her stomach plummeted as she saw his cold, furious eyes lock onto hers. Every head in the restaurant turned. The quiet hum of conversation died, replaced by a tense, expectant silence. The performance was about to begin. He waited until she was standing beside his table, her hands clasped behind her back in the regulation posture of subservience. He didn't ask her to speak. He leaned back in his chair, swirling the deep red wine in his glass, and addressed the investor, though his words were meant for her and for the entire room. He spoke in a loud, deliberate voice, dripping with theatrical contempt. "What is the single most important asset in the luxury sector?" he asked, not waiting for an answer. "It's not the food, not the decor. It is brand integrity. It is the curation of an experience, a flawless illusion that our clients pay for. And that illusion is shattered when an employee, a sentimental fool, decides to prioritize her bleeding heart theatrics over company policy." He finally turned his venomous gaze on Alara. He told her she was an embarrassment, a liability to the brand he had meticulously built. He mocked her for her gesture, calling it a pathetic, self-serving display that endangered the restaurant's reputation. The air grew thick with humiliation, and Alara could feel the eyes of every single patron on her, their faces a mixture of pity, discomfort, and morbid fascination. As Thorne's cruel words washed over her, a strange and terrible calm settled in Alara's soul. He had called her a liability. That specific word, a cold, clinical term from the world of finance and law, acted as a key, unlocking a door in her mind that had been sealed for 5 long years. Suddenly, she wasn't standing in a restaurant. She was back in a sterile conference room, a terrified college student sitting beside her father as a team of Viridian Global lawyers, led by a younger but equally arrogant Marcus Thorne, dismantled his life's work, document by document. They had used that same word, liability, to describe her father's company, his employees, his legacy. The public humiliation she felt now was a pale echo of the private annihilation her father had endured. The fury that rose in her was not hot and chaotic, but a glacial, solidifying force. It sharpened her focus, cleared her mind, and made her hands steady. She looked at Marcus Thorne, truly looked at him for the first time, and she saw not just a cruel manager, but the architect of her family's pain. In that moment, something inside her broke, but something else, something far more powerful, was forged in its place. The waitress was gone. The Yale law prodigy, fueled by a righteous, calculated rage, was awakening. Her chin lifted, a slow, deliberate movement that seemed to take an eternity. The shift was almost imperceptible, yet it altered the very geometry of power at the table. Her spine, which had been curved in a posture of professional deference, straightened into a column of unyielding steel. The vacant, polite mask she wore in Aurelia dissolved, replaced by an expression of such profound crystalline focus that it was unnerving. The eyes that met Marcus Thorne's were no longer the hazy, tired eyes of a servant. They were the sharp, analytical eyes of a predator that had just identified its prey. A silence, deep and absolute, fell over their corner of the dining room. It was as if she had drawn all the sound, all the ambient energy, into herself, leaving a vacuum in its wake. Thorne, who had been expecting tears or a stammered apology, found himself momentarily silenced by the sheer force of her transformation. He had been performing for an audience, and suddenly his target had become the director of the scene, her silent gaze, a spotlight that was becoming uncomfortably hot. He felt a flicker of confusion, a momentary disruption in his perfect world, but it was quickly subsumed by a fresh wave of irritation at her insolence. The voice that emerged from her was not the one he had heard before, the soft, neutral tone used to describe the daily specials. This voice was different. It was calm, measured, and carried a resonance that seemed to come from a place of deep, unshakable authority. It was a voice that belonged in a courtroom or a boardroom, not beside a table laden with half-eaten entrees. She did not raise it, yet it cut through the lingering tension with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. She addressed him not as a boss, but as an equal, her words stripped of any deference. She stated, simply and without emotion, that his assessment of her actions was predicated on a flawed understanding of asset management. A brand's integrity, she explained, was not merely a curated illusion. It was a reflection of its foundational ethics. An organization that punishes basic human decency, she continued, reveals a systemic weakness, a moral bankruptcy that is a far greater liability than a single unapproved act of compassion. Her language was precise, corporate, and utterly devastating. She was using his own vocabulary, the cold lexicon of power and profit, to dissect his argument and expose its hollow core, turning his weapon back on him with breathtaking skill. The investor at the table, a man accustomed to predatory business tactics, leaned forward slightly, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and fascination. He had come to witness Thorne's power, but he was now witnessing something far more compelling, an intellectual dismantling of that power by the most unlikely of sources. Thorne's face, which had been a mask of smug superiority, began to twitch. A dark flush crept up his neck, a tide of pure, undiluted fury. He was being lectured, corrected, by a waitress. The sheer absurdity of it, the colossal effrontery, was more than his ego could withstand. He opened his mouth to unleash a torrent of abuse, to verbally annihilate her and put her back in her place, but before he could form a single syllable, a new, quiet drama began to unfold at the edge of his vision. The source of the entire conflict, the shivering man from the street, was no longer huddled in a corner. He was standing near the entrance, now wrapped snugly in Alara's coat, and he was holding a phone to his ear. It was not a cheap, disposable phone. It was a sleek, modern smartphone, the kind Thorne himself used, and the man's demeanor was no longer one of desperation, but of calm, focused communication. The man on the street made no grand gestures. His call was brief, his words spoken in a low, even tone that was impossible to hear from across the room. Yet the act itself was a profound disruption of the established order. The homeless were not supposed to have expensive phones. They were not supposed to make calls with an air of quiet authority. Thorne watched, his own tirade dying in his throat, a cold knot of unease tightening in his gut. This was a variable he hadn't accounted for, an anomaly in his perfectly controlled environment. He saw the man end the call, slip the phone back into a pocket, and then simply wait, his gaze fixed on the street outside. There was no fear in his eyes, no gratitude, only a quiet, patient expectation. Alara, for her part, did not look at him. Her focus remained entirely on Thorne, her expression unwavering, holding him pinned in place with the force of her will. The entire restaurant seemed to be holding its breath, the patrons sensing that the initial, ugly spectacle was merely the prelude to something far more significant. The air was charged with an unspoken question, a silent, mounting suspense that was more powerful than any shouted threat. Less than 2 minutes later, the answer arrived. It came not with a siren or a commotion, but with a silent, coordinated precision that was far more terrifying. 3 black sedans, their tinted windows reflecting the city lights like obsidian mirrors, pulled up to the curb in front of Aurelia. They moved in perfect synchronization, their engines purring with a low, predatory growl that was barely audible through the thick plate glass. They did not park in available spaces. They simply stopped, blocking the lane of traffic as if the rules of the city did not apply to them. The doorman, a stoic ex-military man, froze with his hand on the door, his professional composure evaporating into raw apprehension. Doors opened on the sedans and several large men in dark, impeccably tailored suits emerged. They did not rush the entrance. They simply took up positions on the sidewalk, their presence creating an invisible, impenetrable perimeter. They were calm, watchful, and radiated an aura of disciplined violence that was utterly alien to the refined world of Aurelia. They were waiting for their leader. He stepped out of the lead car, and the world seemed to slow down. He was not a large man, but he moved with a dense, centered gravity that drew every eye. His name was Julian Volkov, a name whispered in the darkest corners of the city's financial and political spheres, a name that never appeared in newspapers but was known by anyone who truly understood the mechanics of power. He was dressed in a simple, dark cashmere overcoat and a gray suit, without a hint of flash or ostentation. His face was sharp, intelligent, and bore a placid expression that betrayed nothing. He walked past his men, his stride unhurried, and nodded once to the man in Alara's coat. The man nodded back, a silent exchange of familial understanding. Julian Volkov then entered the restaurant, and a wave of absolute silence rolled through the opulent dining room. The clinking of cutlery stopped. The hushed conversations died. Every patron, every captain, every chef in the open kitchen turned to stare, a primal instinct warning them that a true apex predator had just entered their enclosure. The atmosphere shifted from one of high-end luxury to that of a tomb. Julian Volkov's eyes scanned the room, cool and dispassionate, until they landed on Marcus Thorne. Thorne felt that gaze like a physical impact, a spear of ice pinning him to his chair. The blood drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, waxy white. He knew who this was. Everyone knew. Volkov was a ghost, a legend, the head of a criminal empire so vast and sophisticated that it operated in the spaces between laws, a force of nature that the city's elite pretended did not exist. To see him here, in the flesh, in his restaurant, was a waking nightmare. Volkov began to walk towards his table, his footsteps making no sound on the thick carpet. With each step he took, Thorne's carefully constructed world of arrogance and control disintegrated. The billionaire CEO, the titan of industry, was reduced to a terrified, trembling man, his mind racing to comprehend how this catastrophe had befallen him. The investor beside him looked as if he had seen a ghost, his face pale and his hands shaking slightly as he reached for his water glass. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been utterly and irrevocably annihilated. Volkov stopped beside the table, his presence a vortex of cold, quiet power. He did not look at Thorne. Instead, he looked at Ilara, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Then, he turned his gaze to his brother, who had followed him inside and now stood quietly by the door. Finally, he addressed Thorne, his voice low and devoid of any emotion. It was this absolute lack of anger that made it so terrifying. He spoke clearly, his words dropping like stones into the dead silence of the room. "My brother," he said, gesturing with a slight nod toward the man in the worn coat, was cold. "This young woman," he continued, his eyes now on Ilara, showed him a kindness, a simple human kindness. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "And for this, you sought to humiliate her. You sought to punish her. You brought disrespect to my family." There was no threat, no overt menace, just a simple, chilling statement of fact. For a man like Volkov, disrespect was not a slight to be endured. It was a debt to be collected, and his reputation for collecting those debts was the foundation of his power. Thorne's throat worked, but no sound came out. He was paralyzed, caught between the instinct to flee and the terror of making any sudden movements. His mind, usually a sharp instrument of calculation and condescension, was a chaotic mess of pure, primal fear. He finally managed to stammer an apology, a pathetic, disjointed string of words that sounded hollow and meaningless in the oppressive silence. He offered Ilara her job back, his voice cracking, begging her to stay, his words directed at her but his pleading eyes fixed on the terrifyingly calm face of Julian Volkov. He offered a raise, a promotion, anything. He would have offered her the restaurant itself if he thought it would make this nightmare end. It was the ultimate humiliation. The master of the universe groveling before his waitress, his power exposed as a fragile, pathetic illusion in the face of true, absolute authority. The entire room bore witness to his complete and utter collapse, a spectacle of fear so profound it was almost pitiable. The investor slowly, quietly, pushed his chair back and began to edge away from the table, wanting no part of the fallout. Ilara looked at the terrified man who had, only moments before, tried to destroy her with his words. She felt no pity, no satisfaction, only a cold, clear sense of finality. She had been awakened from a long slumber, and she could never go back to being the invisible waitress in this gilded cage. This place, which had been both her prison and her means of survival, was now nothing more than a stage upon which her new life had been born. With the same quiet, unshakable calm she had discovered moments earlier, she looked directly at Marcus Thorne. "Thank you for the offer," she said, her voice steady and clear, "but I decline. I quit." She spoke the words with no anger, no triumph, just the simple finality of a door being closed forever. She then turned to Julian Volkov's brother, the man still wearing her coat. "You can keep it," she said softly, a genuine small smile touching her lips for the first time. He returned the smile, a look of immense respect in his eyes. Without another word, Elara turned and walked away from the table, her back straight, her steps even and sure. She walked past the stunned patrons, past the frozen staff, and out the front door, leaving behind the wreckage of Marcus Thorne's ego and the silent, menacing presence of the Volkov brothers. The frigid night air felt like a baptism, washing away the cloying scent of truffles and fear. As she walked down the street, the sound of the Volkovs' sedans pulling away behind her was the closing punctuation on a chapter of her life. She did not know what would come next. She was jobless, with a mountain of medical bills and a father who depended on her for everything. A wave of panic should have consumed her, but it didn't. Instead, she felt a profound sense of liberation, a lightness she hadn't experienced in 5 years. The rage that had been a dull, constant ache in her soul had been honed into a sharp, focused instrument. The humiliation had not broken her. It had reforged her. She was no longer just a survivor, enduring her fate one shift at a time. She was a fighter who had just been handed a weapon and a target, the name, Thorne, and the restaurant's parent company, Viridian Hospitality, echoed in her mind, connecting the dots of her past and present with horrifying clarity. The man who had fired her tonight was not just a cruel boss. He was the architect of her family's ruin. The arrogant sneer, the dismissive wave of his hand, the cold, calculating cruelty, it was all the same. She remembered him now, from that final devastating meeting 5 years ago. He had been younger, but the soulless ambition in his eyes was identical. He had sat across the table from her father, using arcane legal jargon and predatory clauses to dismantle a company built on a lifetime of hard work and integrity. He had called her father's business a, quote, non-performing asset, to be liquidated for maximum shareholder value. He had stripped her father of his company, his dignity, and ultimately, his health, and he didn't even remember her. To him, she and her father were just another line item in a long history of corporate conquest, collateral damage in his relentless climb to the top. The realization did not bring despair. It brought a terrifying, righteous clarity. This was not a coincidence. It was a reckoning. As she continued to walk, the city lights blurring through the tears that now streamed down her face, tears not of sadness, but of incandescent fury, a new feeling began to take root in her heart. It was not a desire for revenge, not in its simplest, most brutal form. It was a hunger for justice, a precise, systematic, and legally unimpeachable justice. The kind of justice the law was supposed to provide but so often failed to deliver to the powerful. He had used the law as a weapon to destroy her family. She would now use her knowledge of that same law as a shield and a sword. He had blacklisted her from serving water in this town, a petty act of a tyrant. She would ensure that he would never again sit at the head of a boardroom table. Her mind, once a dormant library of legal knowledge, was now buzzing with activity. Cases she had studied, statutes she had memorized, loopholes she had debated in late-night study sessions. It all came flooding back, not as academic theory, but as a practical, lethal arsenal. She reached her small apartment, the contrast with Aurelia's opulence, a stark reminder of what she was fighting for. The smell of antiseptic and the quiet, rhythmic sound of her father's breathing machine greeted her. She went to his room and watched him sleep, his face peaceful in the dim light. The sight of his frail form solidified her resolve into something unbreakable. This was not just about her humiliation or her lost career. It was about reclaiming his honor. It was about ensuring that men like Marcus Thorne could not operate with impunity. destroying lives and families without consequence. She sat down at her small, cluttered desk, her hands no longer shaking. She pulled out an old, dog-eared notebook from her law school days, its pages filled with her precise, meticulous handwriting. It felt like an old friend, a piece of her true self she had long thought buried. With a deep, steadying breath, she picked up her phone. Her fingers flew across the screen, searching for a number she hadn't dialed in 5 years. She found it under an old contact entry. Professor Alistair Finch, her former mentor at Yale, the man who had once told her she had the finest legal mind he had seen in 30 years of teaching. He had been devastated when she dropped out, but he had understood. He had told her that the law would still be there when she was ready. She pressed the call button, her heart hammering against her ribs, not with fear, but with a fierce, exhilarating sense of purpose. The phone rang once, twice, and then a familiar, gravelly voice answered. "Elara, is that you?" The sound of his voice, a voice from her past, from the life she had been forced to abandon, was the final key. "Yes, Professor," she said, her own voice firm, the last traces of the timid waitress gone forever. "It's me. I need your help. I'm ready to come back. I have a case." The war had begun. The first move had been made. Marcus Thorne had fired a waitress. In doing so, he had just hired the legal counsel for his own destruction. The partnership with Professor Finch was a return to a world she thought was lost to her forever. His office was a sanctuary of academia, a stark and comforting contrast to the gilded cage of Aurelia. The air smelled of old paper, worn leather, and the faint, bitter aroma of freshly brewed black coffee, a scent that triggered a cascade of memories from her past life. It was the smell of purpose, of intellectual rigor, of a future that had once seemed so certain. Finch, with his shock of white hair and eyes that still held the sharp, analytical spark she remembered so well, did not treat her as a victim or a former student who had failed. He looked at her as a colleague, a brilliant mind that had been forced into dormancy and was now reawakening. He gave her more than just access to Yale's formidable online legal libraries. He gave her validation. He listened to her story, his expression shifting from sympathy to a cold, academic fury as she detailed the events at the restaurant and the horrifying connection to her father's ruin. He confirmed her strategy was sound. Attacking Thorne for the illegal blacklisting would be a minor victory, a skirmish. The true path to justice lay in dismantling the very foundation of his empire, proving a pattern of systemic corruption that stretched back years, a pattern whose first casualty had been a small, honest manufacturing business run by a man named Robert Vance. The hunt began not with a bang, but with the quiet, relentless click of a keyboard in the dead of night. Elara transformed her tiny apartment into a war room, the walls slowly becoming a mosaic of sticky notes, printed financial statements, and complex diagrams mapping corporate structures. The nights bled into days, fueled by cheap coffee and an unyielding, cold fury. She submerged herself in the digital ocean of Viridian Global's history, a world of SEC filings, quarterly earnings reports, and shareholder communications that would be impenetrable noise to most. For Elara, with her eidetic memory, it was a language she spoke fluently. She devoured thousands of pages of dense legalese, her mind a supercomputer cross-referencing footnotes from a 2017 annual report with asset declarations in a 2019 proxy statement. She slept in 3-hour increments, often waking with the ghost of a legal precedent on her lips. The rhythmic pulse of her father's oxygen machine in the next room was her metronome, a constant, sobering reminder of the stakes. There were moments of profound frustration, weeks spent chasing phantom shell corporations registered in the Cayman Islands that led to digital dead ends, their ownership intentionally obscured by layers of legal firewalls. Doubt would creep in, a cold whisper in the lonely hours before dawn, telling her that Thorne's fortress was too high, his walls too thick. But then she would look at a faded photograph on her desk, a picture of her father, beaming with pride on the factory floor of the company he had built from nothing, and the doubt would burn away, replaced by the white-hot certainty of her mission. The breakthrough came from a place she least expected it, a memory of a seemingly insignificant detail from her father's final desperate days of fighting the takeover. He had mentioned something about land, a series of small, overlooked real estate transactions Viridian had made in the industrial park surrounding his factory, months before the official acquisition bid. At the time it had seemed irrelevant, a minor strategic move. Now, 5 years later, it felt like a loose thread in an otherwise perfect tapestry. With a renewed sense of purpose, Alara pivoted her investigation away from the parent company's public filings and into the murky world of municipal property records and zoning applications. It was a painstaking analog process requiring her to file digital requests with county clerks' offices across 3 states. For weeks, the trickle of information was useless, a collection of mundane deeds and permits. But then, a pattern began to emerge, faint at first, then undeniable. A handful of newly formed LLCs, all with anonymous registered agents and post office boxes for addresses, had purchased undervalued, semi-derelict industrial properties. These purchases were always followed, within a matter of months, by sudden and unexpected rezoning decisions from local councils, transforming the land from low-value industrial use to high-value commercial development. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place when she discovered the last step in the chain. Viridian Hospitality would then purchase these newly valuable properties from the LLCs for a massively inflated price, often 10 or 20 times their original cost. She had found it. It was a classic, brutally effective scheme of insider trading and shareholder fraud, hidden in plain sight across a dozen dusty county records offices. Thorne was using these anonymous shell companies, which she was now certain he secretly controlled, as a personal enrichment vehicle. He would use his corporate influence and backroom political connections to get the zoning changed, artificially creating value out of thin air. Then he would use his authority as CEO to have his own public company, Viridian, buy the land at an exorbitant premium, effectively transferring millions of dollars from his shareholders' pockets directly into his own. The genius of the scheme was its fragmentation. Each individual transaction looked like a normal, if slightly overpriced, real estate deal. Only when viewed from a macro level, with all the pieces assembled, did the breathtaking scale of the criminal conspiracy become clear. The memory of her father's confusion about the land deals now made a sickening kind of sense. Those purchases hadn't been a prelude to the takeover. They were the model for the crime itself, a test run for a system of fraud he would perfect over the next 5 years. Alara felt a wave of nausea mixed with a chilling sense of vindication. She had the architecture of the crime, the blueprint of his greed. But a blueprint wasn't enough to convict. She needed to place Marcus Thorne's hand on the pen that signed the checks. Professor Finch, upon reviewing her findings, was astounded by the elegance and audacity of the fraud. He agreed that the circumstantial evidence was overwhelming, but to build an ironclad case, they needed a human source. They needed an insider, someone who had been on the other side of the firewall, and could provide direct evidence of Thorne's involvement. The search for this individual was a delicate and dangerous operation. Alara spent a week meticulously researching Viridian's executive turnover for the past 5 years, creating a short list of high-level employees who had left the company abruptly or under acrimonious circumstances. She cross-referenced their names with social media and news articles, looking for any hint of disillusionment or bitterness. Her search eventually led her to one name, Arthur Gable, Viridian's former chief financial officer. Gable had been hailed as a financial wizard, Thorne's right-hand man for nearly a decade, until he had been unceremoniously fired 18 months ago, replaced by a younger, more compliant executive. The official reason given was strategic restructuring, but the industry rumor mill whispered of a falling out, a clash of wills over the company's increasingly aggressive accounting practices. Gable had since dropped out of public life, a ghost in the corporate world. He was their best, and perhaps only, shot. Finding Arthur Gable was one thing. Convincing him to talk was another entirely. He was a man who had been burned, a man who knew exactly how ruthless Marcus Thorne could be when crossed. Ilara, through a contact of Professor Finch's in the financial journalism world, obtained a private email address for him. She crafted her message with the precision of a legal brief, careful not to sound threatening or desperate. She didn't mention her father or her personal vendetta. Instead, she laid out a cold, factual summary of the land fraud scheme she had uncovered, citing 2 specific transactions and the corresponding shell corporations. She ended the email with a simple, powerful sentence: "I believe you tried to stop this, and I have the evidence to prove it was a crime." It was a calculated gamble, appealing not to his desire for revenge, but to the professional integrity he had been forced to compromise. For 3 agonizing days, there was no reply. Ilara's hope began to wane, the silence from Gable feeling like a final, insurmountable wall. Then, on the 4th morning, a 1-line email appeared in her inbox. It contained only a time and the address of a quiet, out-of-the-way coffee shop in a sleepy suburban town, miles from the city's financial district. The man who sat across from her in the worn vinyl booth looked nothing like the confident executive from his old press photos. Arthur Gable was a ghost of his former self, a man hollowed out by stress and regret. His expensive suit hung loosely on his thinned frame, and his hands trembled slightly as he lifted a cup of coffee to his lips. He was deeply paranoid, his eyes constantly darting towards the door, expecting to see Thorne's enforcers at any moment. Ilara let him speak first, listening patiently as he recounted the story of his final year at Viridian. He described his growing horror as he realized the true nature of the special projects Thorne was running, the way Thorne had bypassed all internal controls and ethics oversight. Gable had confronted him, armed with his own internal audits, and had been met with a chilling threat. Thorne had reminded him of his family, of his mortgage, of the skeletons in his own closet that could be used to ruin him professionally forever. Gable had been forced into a complicit silence, and the guilt had been eating him alive ever since. He had been fired the moment Thorne felt his loyalty waver, forced to sign an ironclad non-disclosure agreement in exchange for a severance package that was little more than hush money. Ilara didn't offer him empty promises of protection or glory. She offered him something far more valuable, a chance at redemption. She laid out her entire case on the table, not just the real estate fraud, but the way Thorne had systematically preyed on smaller companies, including a detailed account of the predatory tactics used to bankrupt her father's business, though she never revealed her personal connection. She showed him that she wasn't just a disgruntled employee, she was a legal scholar who had built a case that was meticulous, comprehensive, and legally devastating. She explained that his testimony, his inside knowledge, was the final, crucial piece that would transform her investigation from a compelling theory into an undeniable indictment. She wasn't asking him to be a hero. She was asking him to be a witness, to corroborate the truth she had already uncovered. She could see the war raging in his eyes, the terror of Thorne's retaliation battling with the deep, corrosive shame of his own inaction. He stared into his coffee cup for a long, silent minute, the weight of his decision hanging heavy in the air. Finally, he looked up at her, a flicker of his old, defiant self returning to his eyes. He told her there was a fail-safe, a personal insurance policy he had created before he was fired. An encrypted hard drive, hidden away, containing copies of the internal memos, the secret ledgers, and the direct wire transfer authorization signed by Marcus Thorne himself. The exchange felt like something out of a spy novel, adding a layer of surreal danger to her quest. Following Gable's precise, paranoid instructions, Ilara went to a designated branch of the New York Public Library the following afternoon. She located a specific, obscure book on 19th-century maritime law in the stacks. Tucked inside its pages was a small, unassuming USB flash drive. Her heart pounded in her chest as she slipped it into her pocket, the small piece of plastic and metal feeling as heavy as a block of gold. She didn't dare access it on a public network. Back in the relative safety of her apartment, she used a secure laptop provided by Professor Finch, one completely disconnected from the internet, to open the drive. The screen filled with folders, and as she clicked through them, the full scope of Thorne's criminality was laid bare. There were spreadsheets meticulously detailing the flow of money from Viridian's accounts to the anonymous LLCs. There were scanned copies of internal memos, written in Thorne's own arrogant, dismissive prose, explicitly directing the fraudulent transactions. And there it was, the smoking gun, a digital copy of a signed authorization for a $15 million payment to a shell company for a piece of land that had been purchased by that same company only 3 months prior for less than $800,000. The signature at the bottom was unmistakable: Marcus Thorne. While Alara was securing the final pieces of her arsenal, the beast she was hunting began to stir. Marcus Thorne was a man who thrived on control and information, and the sudden, quiet ripples in his world had not gone unnoticed. An automated security alert had flagged a series of unusual, high-level inquiries into the municipal records of several old real estate deals. Separately, his internal IT department reported a low-level data breach attempt on the archived files of a former executive, Arthur Gable. Individually, these events were minor annoyances. Together, they formed a pattern that set off alarm bells in Thorne's paranoid mind. He didn't know who was coming for him or why, but he knew the scent of a threat. His response was immediate and ruthless. A flurry of activity began within the highest echelons of Viridian. Digital files were wiped, servers were reformatted, and a team of consultants was brought in to begin shredding truckloads of paper documents at an off-site facility. He was trying to erase his history, to burn the evidence of his crimes before his unknown enemy could bring it to light. The purge was a sign of his fear, but it was also a ticking clock. Alara knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that her window of opportunity was closing fast. She had the evidence, but if she waited too long, Thorne might succeed in muddying the waters, enough to create reasonable doubt, burying her truth under an avalanche of legal obfuscation. The final piece of the strategy came together in Professor Finch's office, the evidence from Gable's drive projected onto a screen on the wall. The case was complete, a perfect, self-contained narrative of corporate greed and criminal fraud. The question now was not one of evidence but of deployment. A traditional lawsuit would be a war of attrition, a multi-year slog through the court system that Thorne, with his army of lawyers, could easily afford to drag out until she was financially and emotionally exhausted. Leaking the story to the press was another option. But Thorne was a master of public relations, adept at spinning narratives and discrediting sources. He would paint her as a vengeful, unstable ex-employee, and her carefully constructed case could be reduced to a messy he said, she said in the court of public opinion. They needed a venue from which he could not escape, a forum where the evidence could be presented so directly and publicly that he would have no time to spin, no opportunity to hide. It was Finch who suggested it, his eyes gleaming with a strategist's delight. The Viridian Hospitality annual shareholder meeting was less than 2 weeks away. It was Thorne's personal kingdom, the one day a year he stood before his investors and the financial press to celebrate his own genius. To be exposed there in his own temple by his own rules of order would be the ultimate, inescapable checkmate. The plan was audacious, bordering on impossible. Security at a high-profile shareholder meeting was notoriously tight, restricted to accredited investors, board members, and vetted members of the press. Alara, a blacklisted former waitress, had no legitimate reason to be there. But Professor Finch's network ran deep. He made a call to a former student, now a senior partner, at an activist investment fund that held a small but significant block of Viridian shares. The fund manager, a woman who had her own long-standing suspicions about Thorne's ethics, was intrigued by Finch's cryptic request. After a clandestine meeting where Alara presented a sanitized, high-level summary of her findings, the manager agreed to help. She couldn't attend the meeting herself, but she could, and would, grant Alara her official proxy, giving her the legal right to attend and speak on the fund's behalf. A day later, a courier delivered a crisp envelope to Ilara's apartment. Inside was an official, embossed invitation to the Viridian Hospitality Annual General Meeting and a proxy card bearing her name. She held the documents in her hand, the paper cool against her skin. This was it. This was the key to the castle. She had the weapon, she had the map, and now she had a way through the front gate. The final confrontation was set. The stage was Thorne's, but the script would be hers. The ballroom of the Grand Hyatt was a cathedral of capitalism, a vast, impersonal space designed to awe and intimidate. The air was sterile, chilled to a precise temperature, and smelled of new carpets and limitless corporate budgets. 1,000 identical chairs were arranged in perfect rows, each occupied by a person in a dark, expensive suit, their faces illuminated by the cold blue glow of the massive presentation screen that dominated the stage. They were the shareholders, the power brokers, the financial predators and their keepers, a sea of calculated gazes and predatory smiles. Ilara Vance sat among them, an island of calm in a churning ocean of ambition. She wore a simple, dark gray dress, professional yet understated, a deliberate choice to be a blank canvas in a room full of peacocks. Her proxy card and invitation sat in her lap, the paper feeling cool and solid in her hands. Her heart beat a slow, steady rhythm against her ribs, a war drum counting down the final moments to battle. She was invisible here, just as she had been at Aurelia. But this time, her invisibility was a cloak, a strategic advantage. They saw a junior associate, an anonymous representative. They had no idea they were looking at their executioner. On the stage, Marcus Thorne was in his element. He stood at a sleek, minimalist lectern, bathed in the flattering glow of a single, powerful spotlight. He was a master of this theater, his voice resonating with a carefully practiced confidence, his gestures broad and commanding. He spoke of synergy and leverage, of maximizing shareholder value and disrupting legacy markets. His words were a symphony of corporate jargon, meaningless and yet hypnotic to the assembled faithful. He painted a picture of a future where Viridian was not just a company, but a global force, a titan bestriding the world of luxury and power. Ilara watched him, her expression unreadable. She felt no fear, no last-minute hesitation. She simply observed the performance, the final, arrogant monologue of a villain who did not yet know the curtain was about to fall. She saw not the powerful CEO, but the hollow man from the restaurant, the bully who derived his sense of self from the humiliation of others. She thought of her father, of the life he had lost, and the cold, clear purpose in her veins solidified into something as hard and as sharp as a diamond. Thorne finished his speech to a wave of enthusiastic applause, his face beaming with the smug satisfaction of a king surveying his loyal subjects. The floor was opened for the question and answer session. The first few questions were softballs, planted inquiries from friendly analysts and major investors, designed to let Thorne further elaborate on his triumphs. He answered them with practiced ease, his condescension barely veiled. Then, the moderator's gaze swept across the room, looking for the next hand. Ilara stood up. The movement was quiet, fluid, yet it drew a ripple of attention. She did not raise her hand. She simply rose to her feet and began to walk toward the microphone positioned in the center aisle. Heads turned. A low murmur went through the rows. Her progress felt like a walk through deep water, each step a conscious, deliberate act of will. She could feel 100 pairs of eyes on her, questioning, dismissive. Thorne squinted from the stage, his expression a mixture of annoyance and curiosity at this unscheduled interruption. He did not recognize her. To him, she was just another face in the crowd, a minor inconvenience in his perfectly orchestrated day. Ilara reached the microphone, her hand steady as she adjusted it to her height. The low thrum of the ballroom's ventilation system was the only sound. She took a single, deep breath, the air tasting of ozone and impending conflict. she did not begin with an accusation. Her voice, when it came, was calm and clear, carrying to every corner of the vast room with an unnatural clarity. "Mr. Thorne," she began, her eyes locked on his, "my name is Alara Vance. I am speaking today as a proxy for the Northgate Activist Fund. I have a question regarding a series of real estate acquisitions made by Viridian Hospitality in the third quarter of 2019, specifically concerning the purchase of several industrial parcels in the tri-state area from a number of newly registered limited liability companies, one of which was named Apex Land Holdings LLC. The specificity of the question was a stun grenade tossed into the placid room. Thorne's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. A flicker of confusion crossed his face. He began to respond with a dismissive, pre-prepared line about the company's robust real estate portfolio. But Alara did not let him finish. According to public county records, she continued, her voice gaining strength, Apex Land Holdings purchased Parcel 7B in Clifton, New Jersey, for $750,000 in May of that year. Just 4 months later, after a surprising and unmitigated zoning variance was granted by the local council, Viridian Hospitality purchased that same parcel from Apex for $14.2 million. My question is, can you explain to the shareholders the due diligence process that led you to approve a nearly 2,000% markup on a property in just 120 days? The room was now utterly silent. The air crackled with a tension so thick it felt like a physical weight. Thorne's face, projected onto the giant screens on either side of the stage, was a mask of tightening fury. He was beginning to understand. This was not a question. It was an indictment. Alara pressed on, her voice a relentless surgical instrument. And can you explain the similar pattern of acquisition and resale with Ironclad Properties LLC in Connecticut? Or Summit Real Estate Ventures in Westchester County? All of which, according to incorporation documents, list the same registered agent and post office box in Wilmington, Delaware. A post office box, I should add, that is also listed as a secondary address on a personal holding company registered in your name. She let that last statement hang in the air, a drop of poison that contaminated everything. On the screen, Thorne's face had gone from flushed with anger to a ghastly, waxy white. It was in that moment that his eyes, wide with panic, truly saw her, and the memory finally clicked. The waitress. The sentimental fool from Aurelia. The recognition was a visible shockwave, a look of such profound, horrified disbelief that it was almost comical. The blood drained from his face as he realized the sheer, catastrophic scale of his miscalculation. He had tried to ruin a waitress. He had instead unleashed a fury he could never have imagined. The final blow was delivered not with passion, but with the cold, irrefutable weight of the law. These actions, Mr. Thorne, constitute a clear pattern of shareholder fraud, a violation of Section 10B of the Securities Exchange Act of 1934 and SEC Rule 10b-5, prohibiting acts or omissions resulting in fraud or deceit in connection with the purchase or sale of any security. She paused, then delivered the killing stroke. A scheme which, I might add, you first perfected 5 years ago, when you used similar tactics to acquire and liquidate smaller, family-owned businesses to fuel Viridian's expansion, businesses like Vance Manufacturing, owned by my father, Robert Vance. The name, her name, hung in the air, the final, devastating piece of the puzzle. The room erupted. Journalists were scrambling, their fingers flying across keyboards. Board members were staring at Thorne in horror, their own fortunes now tied to his sinking ship. Thorne himself seemed to shrink before their eyes, the powerful CEO persona dissolving into a terrified, cornered man. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He was exposed, dissected, and annihilated on his own stage, in front of his own kingdom, by the ghost of a past he had thought long buried. His reign was over. Type justice in the comments if you got chills when Alara finally exposed the truth. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. Before the meeting had even been officially adjourned, the news was breaking across every major financial network. Viridian's stock price plummeted in after-hours trading, wiping out billions in market capitalization in a matter of minutes. Marcus Thorne was escorted from the stage by security, his face a vacant mask of shock, past the very investors who had applauded him less than an hour before. By the next morning, the Securities and Exchange Commission had announced a formal investigation, and federal agents were seen raiding Viridian's corporate headquarters, carrying out boxes of documents. Thorne's assets were frozen, his empire crumbling into dust. Alara watched it all unfold on the news from her small apartment, feeling not triumph but a quiet, profound sense of closure. She had not just won. She had brought a reckoning. In the days that followed, she was approached by a woman named Catherine Sterling, the CEO of a rival hospitality group and a board member at Viridian, who had been present for Thorne's public immolation. Sterling, a woman known for her sharp mind and even sharper ethics, didn't offer condolences or praise. She offered a challenge. She told Alara that destroying something was easy, but building something better was the true test of character. She offered Alara a position, not just as a lawyer, but as the head of a newly created division of corporate ethics and governance, with the mandate to ensure that a predator like Thorne could never again take root in her organization. 1 year later, Alara stood by the window of her spacious corner office, looking out over the city skyline. The view was a universe away from the one she had from the back alley of Aurelia. She was no longer a ghost in a uniform, but a force in her own right, a respected executive whose name was becoming synonymous with a new, more conscionable form of capitalism. She had used her position to implement sweeping changes, creating worker protection programs and transparent supply chains, proving that profitability and integrity were not mutually exclusive. With the substantial salary she now earned, she had moved her father to a state-of-the-art long-term care facility, a place with sunlit rooms and gentle, compassionate nurses. She visited him every evening, reading to him from his favorite books on history and engineering. Most days he showed no sign of recognition, but sometimes, on the good days, she would finish a sentence, and he would squeeze her hand. A faint, fleeting pressure that was worth more to her than all the stock options in the world. She had not only restored his honor, she had built a legacy upon it, transforming the pain of her past into a shield for countless others. Her journey had come full circle, from a silent victim of corporate greed to a powerful guardian against it, forever ensuring that the quiet, decent people of the world had a champion in the rooms where their fates were decided. If Alara's incredible journey from underdog to powerhouse inspired you, show your support by hitting that like button and sharing this story with someone who needs to see it. And for more unforgettable stories of justice and empowerment, don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell.